anyway, it's intended as an app to allow you to speak to Jesus directly. There are a number of these now, by the way. They're all over the place. Now, I don't know about this gentleman you're talking about. Perhaps the app he's talking about is just simply a chat bot that's intended for education. But for me, the entire process of digitizing culture and cultural transmission, the imprint that these digital technologies are making, already with the internet, you can see it person to person, human to human. And now you're adding to this already kind of cyborgized culture in which we are accustomed to communicating soul to soul through technology. You're adding this non-human sort of cognition, this non-human sort of being or essence to that mix. And if the dreams of Mark Andreessens and the Bill Gates and the Elon Musks and the Ray Kurzweils and all of these guys, these kind of totalizing dreams were to come true, then first we would see a total transformation of our culture and our mode of cultural transmission and mode of life, completely transformed by artificial intelligence itself. And then in the most extreme visions, just simply giving way, the post-human vision, just giving way to it. So yeah, I am not big on the Christian apps. I appreciate the contributions of people like Peter Thiel with ideas like against Edenism, but I am completely on the opposite end of that spectrum. I think this is it's going to be a very poetic and dramatic descent, but a descent it is. But on that note, Scott, I actually don't think it'll be all that bland. I actually think that the dystopias will be plenty, but they'll be contained enough that if you are really, really plucky, if you are very resourceful, that you can live out a beautiful poetic life outside of or in the shadow of this machine. And I am so convicted of it that, I wake up every morning and spring out of bed and kiss the sun hello. Right. I'm not a pessimist, but as far as the kind of larger scale society goes, I think you can pretty much assume that something like the kingdom of Antichrist or something like the prevalence of Maya or something like the destruction of Shiva, that something like a Kali Yuga, something like that is what we can expect going forward. But you got to have fun in the midst of all this dystopia. You can't stress out. This is my philosophy.
Absolutely. Maybe you can, for the audience, give them a sense of what you do and who you are.
Well, Scott, I'm a writer, first and foremost. I'm definitely not a journalist. People call me an AI expert, but that's not really right either. I'm really just a writer. I've lived a lot of different lives, academia, the arena. I was a tour rigger for most of my adult life, meaning suspending light, sound, video, whatnot for the mass hypnosis machine. But I've settled into writing, and at the moment, and by at the moment, I mean for the last 4 years and some change, I've been working with Steve Bannon at the War Room, covering technology in general, but really the transhumanist philosophy that underpins artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, robotics, so on and so forth. But in the end, as a writer, I'm extraordinarily bored with the whole topic of the end of the world, and I look forward to writing about things that will last a bit longer.
And there's a lot of truth in that, isn't there? That people love to live in diagnosis. We've got a lot of diagnosis, but not so much. We've even got a lot of sort of counter fighting, will to power fighting. But what we don't have so much of is the curative. The curative.
Well, you could say that there are so many cures that one would have to live 1,000 lifetimes to take them all.
Yeah, you could say that, although being a Christian, I would just say, well, there's one cure, being Jesus. But it's on that subject, though. I mean, I've seen a lot of what you've seen, some of your lectures, and you seem to be very knowledgeable on the esotericism and the motivating factors. From my perspective, what motivates these people, rather than a literary understanding of transhumanist ideology, from my perspective, from my analysis, it's actually, and Steiner would of course agree with this, it comes from the night side of history, is that they're actually motivated by beings, entities that are beneath the surface. And Land would probably agree with this too, I think. What have you discovered about the motivating factors when it comes to, or what's your view on that when it comes to the motivating impulses behind where AI is going?
There's so many different perspectives on that. There's so many different motivating factors. Some of these guys are just purely materialist. I would say most. And so, beginning with that foundation of a materialist worldview that's fleshed out by the sciences, the notion is simply that, we're floating on a dirt ball through space, and we form a thin, sometimes amusing biological film over top of it, and there is no God, there are no angels, there are no demons, no heaven, no hell, John Lennon, all that. And so we have to work to build God, is the idea from the materialist perspective. And, these guys, most are at least inspired by the traditional religions. Some of them are completely immersed in traditional religion and are kind of creating a materialist inversion of spiritual aspirations. But then there are others who are maybe more overtly into the mystical aspect of technology. Ben Goertzel is a good example. I wrote about him a lot in my book. The title of the book, Dark Aeon, is a reference to the Gnostic aeons. And the cover of the book is an homage to the robot Sophia, kind of clunky, bald-headed, kind of hot in a, bald chick kind of way. But, the purpose of Sophia was to bring the ideas of the singularity to the public. So Sophia appeared at the UN. Sophia appeared, the South by Southwest. Pretty sure TED, if not, they missed a good opportunity. And, was, adopted as accepted as a citizen in Saudi Arabia, these sorts of things. But the real importance of Sophia was a symbol of non-human intelligence that would be kind of paraded around to elites and also to the public by way of television and the internet, and give people that first taste of what it means to interact with a non-human material being. Steiner would say these are, I don't know, Ahrimanic puppets, something like that. But I think it's really hard to nail down. People oftentimes want to, say transhumanism is this, is that. It's globalist, it's liberal, it's atheist, it's satanic, whatever it is, it's eugenicist, whatever. And all those are true kind of across the board. But from one transhumanist to the other, I find that there's enormous variety. And that's just the ones who say, I am a transhumanist. We are promoting transhumanism. And then across time, the first utterance of the word, or the root of the word, was in Dante in the, I believe it was in the Paradiso. And it was the idea of going beyond the human into the spiritual, into the divine. And then it was repurposed in the early 20th century, used by Teilhard de Chardin, and I believe a Russian scientist whose name is escaping me at the moment may have preceded him. But I think it's important to talk about how that notion of transhumanism was, the term itself was used by Teilhard de Chardin in the idea of this process towards an omega point. But it was really made famous by his friend Julian Huxley, who in a 1956 lecture, it was published in 57, entitled Transhumanism, kind of put the stamp on the idea. And for Huxley, it was very different from Teilhard. Teilhard had this very sublime Christianized notion of what the omega point is and what transhumanism would be, whereas Huxley was very much a materialist. He even though he was obsessed with religious traditions, in essence, he was a scientific materialist. So, and just so you can see there at the beginning, this tension between two ways of thought, and that's really continued on and only expanded up until our own day.
Yeah, it's a lot of interesting ideas in there, and finding out where they're grounded. I know the thinker you're talking about. There is some truth to what he's saying in terms of there is an omega point, which is Christ, of course.
And he said that it was Christ.
Yeah. And the thing is, though, I suppose the problem is thinking that, and this is where I think Steiner was right about it, is that Steiner was saying that what's actually going to happen is that the stream will look like, on one side, one group of humanity who identify with the satanic drive, which is Araman, Satan, which is it's earth. It's nested in the earth on its own. It's grounded in the will to power. And this will just look like it's advancing, but it's actually degenerating. It's dissolving the material. And the other stream is essentially really a return to the prodigal son's return to the father. So we have to but that, and in that, Steiner is talking about is that we can't abandon the others. What's going to happen and the apocalypse really articulates this quite well, is that there's going to be a group of people that become objects in the sense that they need saving from this other group. And what that means is people become provoked beings, provoked by temptation always, thinking they're free. It's like a fake freedom offered by the serpent. And so that seems to be what's happening, but it also presents an opportunity for what is the other group supposed to do. I don't think we're supposed to be Luddites in the face of this. We need to be near the stream so we can continuously pull people out of a stream that is looking to just make them a pushed entity in that stream rather than withdrawing out of it and being guided by the Lord. But there's also interesting things said there in terms of their ideology. It seems like it's a Eastern, even if they don't realize it, there's a deep Eastern influence being Luciferic as a hate of the body, an escape of the body. Whereas in Christian, and meaning that what the will to power is looking to do is to become a self-referential, self-authored increase, that to escape what it is, right? Instead, we became conscious of what we are in humanism and the Platonic times. We became conscious of what we are, but what they want to do is author their own will. So it's no longer that's being as God, but not with God. So it's where the stream's sort of going, right? And that's the whole metaphysic is actually built on that. The materialism, the fact that we create the God, that we are the God. That's actually the offer of what the serpent actually offered. But there is a sense where we need to look to the depths of things, because we're not just the body, and escaping it is the Luciferic mistake. But at the same time, Christ came into the body. The body is to be resurrected as well. So we're here to save, not to flee in nirvana. So yeah, I do see there's different motives there, but there's some truths. They're half truths about what is to happen. That seems to me anyway. That usually is a half truth. The devil usually has some truth in what he says. Right?
I've never found anything but an approximation of truth. So I can't. A half truth, you're doing pretty good. You're halfway there. Yeah, I'm not. Myself, most of what I know of Steiner and anthroposophy, I know through anthroposophists. So a lot of it is secondhand through discussions with them. I spent a lot of time reading Steiner while writing Dark Aeon, actually, but it was kind of picked piecemeal from the shelves of the guy whose house I was staying at. He's a radiologist, and he actually took a great interest in the stuff I was doing on AI. because, radiology was slated early on. Jeffrey Hinton, for instance, predicted this inaccurately, that radiologists would be wiped out by AI because AI has a power of pattern recognition that the human eye and the human brain just doesn't seem to stand up to in this specific instance of looking at X-rays and other scans for anomalies. So we talked about this a lot. And, there was an interesting moment. He had described to me of one of Steiner's predictions dealing with the World Wide Web. And this was, of course, in the early 20th century. And this is probably the motif that sticks in my mind the deepest from Steiner. And I read How to Know Higher Worlds at a very young age. I read his book on the Gospel of John, and I've flipped through occult science, and I've read through other things. I mean, it's a vast corpus of work. So most of what I know of Steiner, again, kind of comes secondhand through friends. But this one passage about the World Wide Web, I kept trying to track it down. So I'm scouring all his books, of course, trying online, no luck. And there was a guy who had edited together a volume of Steiner's lectures on technology. It's a great little collection, but it has a really kind of cheesy name. It's so cheesy I can't even remember it off the top of my head. But the important thing is, he sent it to me while I'm still staying at this guy's house. And so I've got the book there. We're standing in the kitchen having beers. And, I look at the book. I'm like, I wonder, will it have it? Will it not? And he had flipped through it. He said it wasn't in there. And I flipped directly, kind of like St. Augustine, right? I flipped directly to the passage immediately. The first thing I opened, and there it is. And the image that Steiner weaves together, I don't take Steiner literally, mainly because I don't see how you could, in a logical, rational fashion, fit all of that together in one worldview that is coherent. But maybe I'm nitpicking. One way or the other, with kind of clairvoyance, with the psychic, to me, I think the dreamlike element of it and the kind of openness of that dreamlike image is part of the value. But he's pretty specific, and he talks about how in the coming epic, the Ahrimanic epic, that you would have the rise from the mineral realm of these plant-like, spider-like entities who would weave a web around the world, and that these plant-like, spider-like entities would be possessed of great wisdom, kind of implying material wisdom, though, and that they would be a dominant sort of being in the Ahrimanic epic. And those who didn't ascend would be forced to merge with these plant-like, spider-like entities. And certainly, just given the work I was doing at the time, it seemed pretty clear that what he was talking about was AI. This was in the 1920s, of course. And, it's just, again, talking about the variety of approaches that people come at this from. I think more in line with Steiner, you had around the same time Fritz Lang, creating Metropolis with the obvious, the inverted pentagram and the obvious connotation that this machine was somehow inherently satanic and evil, or at the very least not of Christ. At the same time, around the same time period, you had J.D. Bernal, a disciple of Freud and a huge influence on Arthur C. Clarke, wrote a book called The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. And so this is in the 20s, and he's very much a materialist. He's kind of, when Steiner talks about the materialists of his era, surely J.D. Bernal is, if nothing else, the perfect archetype for it. But in that book, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, J.D. Bernal describes what technological progress will kind of inevitably look like. And it begins with just the extension, kind of like when Freud talked about man making himself into a prosthetic god by way of his tools, that he's kind of like a little g god in these tools, whether it be a telescope or spectacles or a train or a bomber. All of these things extend our innate power that we have biologically. And so Bernal, kind of working off of that, he first goes through this whole thing about how human beings are becoming these kind of little g gods through the use of the tools that were just coming on in his era: the telegraph, the radio, the automobile, the train, the plane, the ship. So, but he envisioned a state in the not so distant future whereby first human beings would begin to manipulate the genome. Of course, at that time, the concept of DNA wasn't even in the culture. It wasn't in existence. There was this notion of genes, but nobody really knew what they were. He called it the germ plasm. But he knew that in order for human beings to really increase their intellectual and power and their social cohesion and the health and all of this, that we would have to alter that germplasm, alter what we would now call the DNA or the genetics. But he also thought that that wouldn't be sufficient to really reach the full potential of what the technology could do. So as he goes on, eventually you end up with brains that are in vats with electrodes, sending messages through mechanical devices and electronic devices. And then eventually a kind of giant spider-like creature with many legs, with many brains all hooked together that would form a kind of singular consciousness, so that each brain would be kind of like a cell in a single organism. And that this would be the beginnings of what he thought was immortality, because if you could merge all of those brains, the loss of one brain would not mean the loss of the collective consciousness. And that brain, that collective brain, could be kind of extended onward and onward into the future. And by the end, he envisioned this whole process culminating in a state of nirvana and, or samadhi. And it would just be pure bliss, that they would have kind of nailed down the method to pump pure bliss into the brain and nothing else, and I guess to sustain it. So there at the very beginning of, or at least there early on in the 20s, you have three somewhat different but also interlocking perspectives on what technology meant. You have Steiner with a kind of a very techno-negative or techno-pessimistic attitude, derived from his notion of Ahriman, the materialist spirit, the calcified spirit. You had Bernal, who thought that, nature is sufficient unto herself. And so really what we would have to do is harness nature's powers to bring into existence the sorts of beings and whatnot that Steiner says are the essence of reality. And then a really great movie, Metropolis, which I think kind of ties both of them together.
Yeah, that's great. I think that all does tie very well together in terms of how I understand philosophy. Because really, technology, the ground of what technology is related to the word techne. It goes all the way back to Greek metaphysics, and Heidegger talks about this. Techne used to be connected to what the Greek word for art is, then it's split in two, and techne became man was terrorized by the uncertainty of the world he was in Greek times. Concepts themselves would actually appear outside rather than inside. And so he was in a world where he was assaulted on all sides, really trying to rationalize, trying to get out of the stream of the of realism, the stream of realism, and so he has to become his own terror to overcome it. And so, really, technology isn't the robot, isn't the this or the that. It's the rigid, even starting with Aristotelian logic. It's the rigid, dead idea superstructure that we all live in our, which I actually call the thought regime. That partly is why Christ came, to bring life back into it and to dissolve it. The intellect and the spirit can still be united, of course, and reintegrated and redeemed, because that's part of the whole thing. Another one of the reasons why Christ came. And so it's a very old problem. People need to understand that the technical is in you. It's merely an extension. The AI a way to think about it might be that it's the dead bark. Now, if you look to the roots, that's us grounded at the essence of our being in Christ, with the image and likeness of God. We're grounded in the eternal. But as in the modern world, in the existential bubble that we're sort of in, you don't really have access to that. You're sort of just thrown into the world. Your memory only proceeds back to when you were born, right? And the edge of that is the throne that you are. Throne meaning you're the subject. Your subject means under the throw. And the object is thrown here, if you look to the etymology of the word. And so that's a good point, is that to recognize that it's in you, and the bringing back life. It's the bark, and it's in you, and you're made up of that bark as an idea superstructure. But actually, you have to get to the roots of the tree, to the essence of things, and we have those qualities and faculties that can do that, and deeper levels of understanding if you dwell, which is what monastics do. Monastics dwell in things and attend to concentration. With prayer allows you to find the silence, to find these deeper levels of being that are underneath just the intellect and just logic. And so that faculty of logic actually is something that develops in the serpent's alternate way. That serpentine alternate way is the rationalizing, is a separateness from, you could call it the divine archetypal Garden of Eden. It's an alternate thing offered through the temptation. And then we got wrapped up in that stream and sort of entered this evolutionary process. But really, AI, it is an extension of that low cunning, that low slithering of the logic on the horizontal of the world. How to better do things here to overcome everything else. The war of all against all. How to, again, it's the will to power. And the ultimate being that you're talking about with the spider's web is the Übermensch that Nietzsche talks about. You probably know at least of that concept of Nietzsche.
Yes, of course.
That is where evolution all the way to the beginning is going. So that's its end point. But at the same time, it's not the only guiding principle. The other guiding principle being the Lord. And differentiation from this Garden of Eden if you're in contact with it. So there is a virginal nature, and then there is at the same time a low nature that was offered by the serpent. And you can see that in the sense that the cell itself, it reflects archetypally, it's similar to the solar system. There's no evolution in the solar system. There's no evolution of it. Like, I guess people would talk about it came from some primordial cloud. But even just looking at the human as an analogy, it doesn't evolve from the bones to like the mineral kingdom to the plant kingdom it doesn't evolve from the bones and then the cell and then it's a unity that grows together, right? So just as an analogy. And so that spider's web technical in framing, I think Steiner talks a lot. In his public lectures, he'll talk in symbolism. And then when he'll do private lectures with the Anthroposophical Society, he'll get more into details. It's funny with Steiner, some of the stuff is very symbolic. Like, say, he's talking about Atlantis and that sort of thing, right? Understanding that is quite difficult, what he means. But it's when you start reading all the way, you get an idea of a lot of it is talking symbolically about certain things, but not always. Sometimes it's really just a different understanding of what we are, because we're not just the embodied being. And that's true of theology. Even says that we are also the image and likeness of God, and we're nested in the ground of our being in the eternal, outside of temporality. That being said, that's you don't want to be Gnostic about it in terms of trying to escape the body. That's
to that point, you mentioned a moment ago that relationship of Gnosticism to transhumanism and the kind of viewing the body in this profoundly negative way and seeking to transcend it. That's certainly a thread. It's a thread that I follow pretty closely in the book. Again, the book itself is an homage to Gnosticism. It carries, I go into a lot of other realms to get to the final destination, but that thread runs throughout, and in many ways it's a refutation of the notion that transhumanism is kind of just Gnosticism, or even that transhumanism as a whole is a materialist version of Gnosticism. There's again a thread of that. You can find it in Bostrom, you can find it in Bernal, you can find it to some extent in Kurzweil, although I would say Kurzweil is maybe much more in between. You can find it in Goertzel. You can find it in a lot of different transhumanists. But so that notion, that kind of rejection of the body, transhumanism in its form, say with Julian Huxley, and this idea that once man has, he wasn't really talking about technology so much. Again, this is the 50s. You would think it had kind of seeped into his thinking, but at least in that essay and in subsequent essays, his primary concern was changing human beings genetically and culturally, eugenics, both biological and cultural eugenics. It was also maybe more gentle. It wasn't like he wanted some kind of state-enforced eugenics like under Hitler, or even the U.S. Before the end of before World War II kind of swept eugenics under the rug. But that was his main point of view, and it was an emphasis on the body, right? It was as much of the flesh as, say, the kind of anthropology of man in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. And so that extends on into Max More. Max More took the term transhumanism, he or kind of independently recoined it, and brought it back to the forefront in the 80s and the 90s. And Max More, and I've had discussions with him about this many times, completely rejects any notion of Gnosticism. And if you think about the construct of the kind of transhuman cyborg or even a post-human state, it's the direct opposite of Gnosticism, even if it reflects it. Because what you're talking about is the perfection of the body. It's an emphasis on the physical. It's a desire to remain incarnate indefinitely. And then as you move into the kind of transhuman and post-human versions, you do then get something like Gnosticism, but unlike Gnosticism, which teaches a kind of something similar to Plotinus, this notion of an emanation from a one, from a pure one. And this concept that, you know, to whatever extent the physical is inherently flawed or fallen, it rests on the foundation of the eternal light, or the eternal knowing, or the eternal being. Whereas transhumanism, again, like at the basis is physics. That the basis is matter, energy, space, and time. It's very different from the notion of like a transcendent father. And so the notion of transcendence, of moving out of the body into some other new form, be it robotic or, you know, data center, virtual world, all of these different versions exist within that you know, kind of diverse thing we would call techno-religion. But the real essence of it is still profoundly material. For instance, the pleroma, the fullness of light described by the Gnostics as kind of the origin and goal of the human soul, is very, very different than data centers pocking the earth or the entire, you know, solar system to, you know, capture the energy of the sun to keep the servers going so that we have virtual worlds to live in. That's very tenuous. It's very fragile. So it is like there is a reflection, but there's a reflection of Christianity within transhumanism, the Kurzweilian narrative of resurrection. There's a reflection of Buddhism in transhumanism, made explicit by people like James Hughes. And so it's much more about becoming, you know, gentle. It's about cultivating ahimsa. It's about ending suffering. It's about trying to find some kind of nirvana by way of neurotechnology. There's an essence of Hinduism, especially in the mythos of Hinduism. There's an essence of the kind of Taoist alchemist, of the European alchemist. So I guess what I'm saying is that in my exploration of the space known as transhumanism, which, transhumanism is really a passé term. It was a passé term when I, started blasting it out to the world 4 years ago. But it is like, to the extent we kind of look at that umbrella of what David Noble in the 90s called the religion of technology. If you look at that whole umbrella, pretty much any visionary, inspirational sort of religious worldview or aspects of it can be translated onto the technological, so that it becomes, you could say, from a transhumanist point of view, the realization of the magical and of the divine that never existed. Or from my own perspective, I do believe that the divine exists as the solid ground upon which we stand. And when our bodies float away, that being is still rooted. From that perspective, AI, especially, and robotics, this golem, it appears as a mockery of what is human. In the same way that, it's been said that God, or that Satan is the ape of God, the imitator of God. I think that AI is the ape of the image of God in man. And
Yes.
I think that this is a bias that I have, and I don't know that I could be talked out of it. But that, to me, is, in its very essence, that imitation or that mockery is kind of the reason I am much more on the Luddite bent, at least ideologically. Obviously, a true Luddite wouldn't be talking on the internet, but I suspect that all of this seductive web will prove to be kind of fundamentally, if not evil, certainly not an extension from the root that has gone a bit too far and has begun to wither. Less bark and more like artificial bark, right?
Absolutely. There's so much in that the word reflection is important. And what I see in it is not only an imitation, but it's an intended distraction as a replacement for all the things. It appears opposite to the Gnostic thing, because Christ is in between those, because the fall happened, temporality exists, and he incarnated to save us, right? So it's a middle road. We don't flee like the Easterners to nirvana. We actually make contact with the Lord, but it's a saving mission. We don't abandon what we're here for. We don't abandon what we're here for to leave. We don't commit suicide like the Stoics. That's not a noble thing. But yes, like you're saying about AI, it's a replacement for all the fundamental needs of a being that is truly actually nested in essence, nested in the eternal. It's sort of gold for God. It's life extension for true immortality. The serpent offered all these things in the Garden of Eden, right? He offered, he keeps his promise in a way. His freedom, they're all fake freedom though, right? But the way you're articulating is just so clear that like you said, the server banks to create the virtual world as a fake eternal, basically. But what are these things really? They're the incarnations of the gods of existence, meaning the false gods of existence, not the one true God of essence, which is, of course, it's Jesus Christ and the Father. And what do those gods? There's a great book called the Anthropological Structures of the Imaginary, where it articulates how what we see in human knowing now, human logos, and what we know, and the things that we do are actually connected to pagan entities and pagan gods, and how they reflected that. And there's a lot of truth to this. Is that a lot of this, if Freudianism, for instance, is the god Astartes in an ideological structure. Moloch is in communism, in the sacrifice of the individual for the collective, and AI, of course, that's the incarnation of Satan, right? That's come, and Satan, of course, is the will to power, and so that's what's going to happen. But there's an interesting thing that came to mind when you were talking earlier, which was I've seen some Christians, a person called Matt Fradd. He has a Catholic podcast. You probably know about him, or you might know
No.
who that is. No, he just has a Catholic podcast. Bannon probably would know. But I noticed that he was advertising a Christian AI.
Oh yeah, this is rampant.
I'm just thinking, what are you doing? That's actually it will claim it is Christ, eventually. But what do you think of that in terms of how?
I mean, to me, it's complete. It's a complete abomination. It's blasphemy. I mean, but again, my bias is pretty clear. I'm not really a heretic hunter or a witch burner, so I'm not going to go to their houses and bring a torch mob to lynch them for creating Christian AI apps that talk to you in the voice of Jesus or whatever it is. Some of them are just study apps, but no, this has been from the beginning. I remember when I first started with the War Room, transhumanism was something that it was kind of a side interest for me. It was something, technology as a whole was of great interest, but transhumanism as an idea, especially as I had first absorbed a kind of version of it from Ray Kurzweil really early on, seemed very ridiculous to me. But in Ray Kurzweil, right? I mean, in the book that I read so many years ago, The Age of Spiritual Machines, it was very clear that what he was talking about was religious. He spoke of things in religious terms. He's describing the process of resurrection by which you take all the patterns of a human existence and you digitize it, first in a kind of cyborg form that's able to really absorb all that you are, both physiologically and mentally, and also through, the data of your utterances and your typing and so on and so forth. And then, that being a kind of a soul creation, something like many alchemists would have described, or some mystery schools would have described. But again, with those institutions, mystery schools, or the kind of decentralized alchemists, by and large, this is not all of them, but by and large, the goal was to manifest something that was already there, something that was already eternal. Whereas with Kurzweil, it seemed, his evolutionary point of view is one, he really does ground it in the simple becoming the complex, right? So, you begin with the singularity, boom, big bang, then the simple hydrogen, the simple suns, and then only after a few supernova do you get enough elements, the complexity, to start creating life. But even then, it begins with simple cells and simple organisms and simple social animals. And then eventually, the complexity grows and grows to the human, which then becomes a kind of paradigm for the simple in comparison to the whole of the superorganism of humanity, and especially the superorganism as guided by first the technological communications of, say, the telegraph or the radio or any other kind of signals communication, but then eventually guided by the algorithms themselves. So Kurzweil is describing this religious worldview, but it is still very like pro-human. He still believes that he believes that's the flowering of the human, and so in a sense he is an atheist, but in a sense he sees himself as doing the Lord's work. Well, that idea goes back to some of the earliest ideas about technology. Plato speaks, I think, very reverentially of the artisans, those who employ techne in his dialogues. You have in Augustine this sort of, it's kind of detached from it. Certainly Augustine wasn't trying to promote the arts, right, the techne, as some sort of salvific principle, but he did see the various arts and amusements around him in the late Roman Empire as being a gift from God that would relieve the suffering of a fallen existence. You see in I get most of this from David Noble, whose book, by the way, The Religion of Technology, it had a huge impact on me. And then in the monks, you see, the grindstone, the windmill, the water wheel, more and more precise, farming equipment and things like that, the plows, that they saw this increasingly as God kind of working through humans. There were even moments in history in which they argued that our technology, our arts, right, our arts and crafts would be weapons against the Antichrist. And that extends on up to our present day. There was this guy, Emil Torres, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who wrote about Steve in the War Room and transhumanism. And, you know, I actually contacted him. The guy knows me. And, you know, he's writing about, he's like, there's a merging between the Christian MAGA and the technological MAGA, you know, the signs are all there. And I'm like, you freaking dumb. Like, yeah, dude, we've covered this for 4 years. This is, and he's like, oh, well, everybody, you know, I've also heard other people cover. Like, dude, it's not about who's covering. What I'm saying is, like, how did you guys present this as if it's something new? This is a discussion that's been going on for decades, if not centuries. So, anyway, just the whole tone of it annoyed me. And it really annoyed me that he's like talking about it as if we're somehow a part of it. He's like analyzing us like animals, you know, like this is a point of discussion over at the War Room constantly. You know, beginning with, and I have respect for Andrew Torba for his efforts at free speech over at Gab, but Torba very early on began producing and deploying Gab AI for image generation, Gab AI for chat. And the whole notion was that it would be trained in such a way that it would only convey truth, meaning Christian truth. You know, you could say a fairly idiosyncratic Christian truth. You had people producing, and then it was boosted on Fox News, boosted, not really criticized, an app called Talking to Jesus or Talking with Jesus. And it's just trained on all the statements of Jesus. And there's also a Lucifer mode you can kick on that's trained on a Satan mode.
The second part of this conversation is available for fellowship joiners. The links are in the replies. Join my website at scottmannion.com/fellowship or on substack.scottmannion.com.